Okay, so the next story that I want to discuss is On the Rainy River. And this story is on page 43. So in this story, we have Tim O'Brien reflecting back on his early life and this moment when he received his draft notice. And this would again lead him to make this very important decision in his life, whether or not he was going to enter the military or skip the draft and escape or flee to Canada and avoid having to serve in the Vietnam War. So he reflects back on this moment, this decision that he has to make at this time in his life. So this story is set in 1968. Tim O'Brien is 21 years old, and it's sort of the narrator is, the mature writer, 40-year-old Tim O'Brien, looking back on his experience and this decision that he made as a younger man. So at 21 years old, Tim O'Brien had, his whole life ahead of him. He had plans to go to graduate school at Harvard, and then this moment occurs where his draft notice appears in the mail, and he is uh, completely conflicted about what to do. He doesn't believe in the war, so he doesn't think it is justified. It's not a war that he feels is sort of clear cut the same way, World War II was, where there was a sort of um, a sense of there's overcoming evil, defeating a dictatorship. Here we have more sort of morally confused, a gray area of whether or not America is justified in its invasion of Vietnam. So on political level, Tim O'Brien sort of suggests that he did not feel this war was justified. He didn't believe in it. This is part of his conflict. So he's sort of morally conflicted whether or not he should be serving at all. But I want to focus more on this other half of his conflict, which is this sense of obligation and the cultural expectations that are placed on him as a young man in relation to serving his country. So there are certain pressures that he feels in relation to this decision that relate to his gender identity. So let's read a section here. So on page 48, if you want to follow along, we have him thinking about this dilemma in relation to his reputation as a man. So he says in the middle of the page, it was a kind of schizophrenia, a moral split. I couldn't make up my mind. I feared the war, yes, but I also feared exile. I was afraid of walking away from my life, my friends, and my family, my whole history, everything that mattered to me. I feared losing the respect of my parents. I feared the law. I feared ridicule and censure. My hometown was a conservative little spot on the prairie, a place where tradition counted, and it was easy to imagine people sitting around a table down at the old Gobbler Cafe on Main Street, coffee cups poised, the conversation slowly zeroing in on the young O'Brien kid, how that damn sissy had taken off for Canada. At night when I couldn't sleep, I'd sometimes carry on fierce arguments with those people. I'd be screaming at them, telling how much I detested their blind, thoughtless, automatic acquiescence to it all, their simple-minded patriotism, their prideful ignorance, their love it or leave it platitudes, how they were sending me off to fight a war they didn't understand and didn't want to understand. I held them responsible. So in this passage, we have a sense of anger, a sense of frustration, and a kind of fear, right? So he feared losing the respect of his parents, of the townspeople. So I don't know how many of you could sort of relate to this aspect of coming from a conservative small town where people talked about you, where your reputation was, a matter of gossip, or if you did something wrong, if you uh, got in trouble by the law or by your parents or something, people would know about it, find out about it, and you would become sort of, your reputation would be ruined. And then even the fact that, uh, they referred to, he's worried about being called a sissy, something like that. This sort of suggests that his own sense of self, his gender identity, his masculinity is somehow tied up with this decision whether or not he chooses to serve in the military or flee to Canada. So he is feeling the cultural, social pressures of living up to a gender identity, of serving his country. So patriotism here and masculinity are very much kind of aligned. In making this decision, he also has to sort of confront some of the ingrained social or gender roles and expectations that he has for himself, that he's been sort of socialized to accept, or that are become sort of part of his identity. So on the very first opening of the story, he acknowledges that he sort of had a perception of himself as having the potential of being heroic and courageous. And he sort of roots this idea as part of his childhood socialization in sort of idealizing somebody like the Lone Ranger. So you can sort of think back, this would be the 60s. The Lone Ranger would have been a kind of uh, almost like superhero figure, somebody you would look up to, idealize, and idolize, want to emulate. So for young Tim O'Brien as a child, he would look up to the Lone Ranger as a kind of hero. And then he always saw himself as a kind of heroic type as well. So this is partially why he feels such shame and humiliation in telling this story at all. So we get that sense that this is something that he still feels a measure of embarrassment about, because it's something that he is not proud of. And so he says, still, it's a hard story to tell. All of us, I suppose, like to believe that in a moral emergency we will behave like the heroes of our youth, bravely and forthrightly, without thought of personal loss or discredit. Certainly that was my conviction back in the summer of 1968. Tim O'Brien, a secret hero, the Lone Ranger. If the stakes ever became high enough, if the evil were evil enough, if the good were good enough, I would simply tap a secret reservoir of courage that had been accumulating inside me over the years. So, we grew up in a different generation. We have different heroes that we looked up to, but I think we can all relate to being a child and having a certain idealized hero that we look up to, and we sort of believe we have those same capabilities as. So in relation to Tim O'Brien's sort of sense of gender identity, he sort of views masculinity, his identity, as heroic, right? So he sees himself as having this potential of being a hero. And this story kind of plays out in a way where he confronts his cowardice. So that dilemma or duality between being a coward or being a hero is partially what this decision comes down to. But it is also very ironic in the way that he defines being a coward and being a hero. So as the story goes on, he finds himself at this kind of crossroads and has to make a decision one way or the other. So he ends up heading to the Canadian border, where he meets Elroy. And Elroy is he's an 80-year-old man who owns this lodge, and Tim O'Brien is staying at this lodge, sort of procrastinating on making this decision. So he's at the sort of border between the Canadian-American border, and he hasn't quite crossed over into Canada. So he's at this very sort of important decision he has to make. And then it seems as if Elroy is sort of helping him make that final decision, and he leads him on this sort of journey, personal kind of journey as well. So it's both an actual boat ride, but it's also sort of Tim O'Brien probing into himself, taking a kind of personal survey of his own life, his own thoughts. And once he gets to this breaking point, so he is guided across the river, all he has to do is jump in the water and go across the border, and he'll be in Canada. But he can't make that decision. He can't jump into the deep end, so to speak. And he's sort of just paralyzed, and it ends up with him breaking down in tears. So on page 59, we have Tim O'Brien reflecting on how he is sort of stuck. He can't decide, he can't act, and all I could do was cry, he says, quietly, not bawling, just the chest chokes. So he's kind of breaking down into tears, and at an obvious, crossroads in his life. And at this point, he's really sort of struggling with what he is supposed to do. So the fact that he is reflecting on his fear, I think, is very sort of honest and an intimate portrayal of what this young man was going through. And I think even, writing about a man who breaks down into tears around this decision, Tim O'Brien is doing something different, right? So he is showing how even somebody who we know is very sort of masculine, and he becomes a soldier, and he will accomplish much in his life, still has this underlying vulnerability, and can express his emotions in this way. And then right then we have Tim O'Brien. So he reflects on this moment, and he has this kind of fantasy image, right? So at this moment when he's going to make his decision, he realizes in sadness what it comes down to. And then he says, and what was so sad, I realized, was that Canada had become a pitiful fantasy, silly and hopeless. It was no longer a possibility. Right then, with the shore so close, I understood that I could not do what I should do. I would not swim away from my hometown and my country and my life. I would not be brave. That old image of myself as a hero, as a man of conscience and courage, all that was just a threadbare pipe dream. Bobbing there on the rainy river, looking back at the Minnesota shore, I felt a sudden swell of helplessness come over me, a drowning sensation, as if I topped overboard and was being swept away by the silver waves. And then he has this kind of flashback or sort of image or fantasy that everybody he's ever known, everybody he will ever know, all the important figures in his life are on the shoreline cheering him on to make this decision. And he sees himself, so he sees chunks of his own history flash by. I saw a 7-year-old boy in a white cowboy hat and a Lone Ranger mask and a pair of holstered six-shooters. I saw a 12-year-old little league shortstop pivoting to turn a double play. So he sort of reflects on all these social influences, cultural influences that have sort of added or influenced